Hi, and welcome to CalCPA's Tariff Tip Series, where today we're going to be focusing on the wine industry. I'm Tim Gillihan. I'm an Executive Vice President with JS Held in the Economic Damages and Valuations practice, and I'm based in San Francisco. Due to my proximity to Sonoma and Napa, I've had the opportunity to work on hundreds of cases involving wineries and vineyards, and can use that experience to help talk about the impact of tariffs on the wine industry. And I'm here today with my colleague, Andrea.
I'm Andrea Cornney. I am the VP of Supply Chain and Sustainability for JS Held. My background is in global supply chain and have quite extensive experience on sanctions, tariffs, and everything related to all industries in a more general context. So I'm going to share my knowledge with you and build on top of giving you some tips and tricks for how it applies to the wine industry.
And today we're going to be discussing key tariff developments, as Andrea was just mentioning, as it relates to the wine industry. So I think the first thing to do is kind of set the stage for what is the state of the wine industry today. It's already, unfortunately, a difficult climate for the industry. After a brief spike in wine consumption around COVID, demand has been falling as younger generations are drinking less wine. When we take a look at what that consumption has actually looked like year to year, we see that the trend downwards really started prior to COVID. We saw in 2018 and 19 that the wine growth or the consumption of growth in prior years had been coming to an end. That end of the growth was somewhat masked by that increase during COVID in 2020 and 21. But once that passed, we got right back on that trend line of downward consumption. What we see in the most recent year, 2024, was that consumption was down about 18% on an overall basis from its peak in 2021. And it's even higher on a per person basis, with consumption down about 20% per capita. There's a couple of reasons why, or a few theories out there about what is creating this headwind for the industry. Part of it is age related. When we look at where the market growth was coming from over the past couple of decades, it was largely being driven by baby boomers and Gen X. But those generations are starting to age out of their peak consumption years, and younger generations are not adopting wine consumption like those prior generations did. If we look at the demographic group of 18 to 34-year-olds, about 20 years ago, this group, about 75% of them were regular wine consumers, and that's down now to about 60%. The reason for these shifts are multiple. And again, there's various theories about them. Some of them have to do with other choices that are available to consumers. Things like hard seltzer, canned cocktails, and even non-alcoholic options like cannabis could be the reason why you see preferences shifting away from wine consumption. There's also been more abstention overall, not just from alcoholic drinks, but from any sort of consumption of things such as cannabis, tobacco, other products like those. And a lot of this may be driven by health concerns and renewed focus on wellness and those trends. Today, about 50% of Americans think that alcohol consumption in any amount is bad for your health, and only about 10% think that alcohol is good for your health. Now, if we go back and look at these same surveys about 15 years ago, it was about split, about the same percentage, 25% thought that drinking alcohol was bad for you or good for you. But since then, in the intervening 15 years, we've seen a huge shift. And part of this is coming from guidance from organizations like the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, which have issued statements saying that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption. And again, some of it is just changing preferences and changing options overall and focus on clean eating, clean living. We see it also with zero alcohol or low alcohol products on the market. Some of those in the wine space, but many of those we see in the cocktail and beer space. So all of these add up together to a really difficult changing environment for the market when it comes to the wine industry and the wineries, the distributors, the retailers, all of those different segments within the industry. We're seeing this play out on the supply side too, a reaction to this drop in demand. If we look at recent grape crush statistics, we see that California had a drop of production of almost a quarter in grapes that were crushed from 23 to 2024. And in 2024, it was actually the smallest crop that had been crushed in the last 20 years, going back to 2004. Even with that small crush, there were still more than 100,000 tons of grapes that were left on the vine and not even picked. And we're seeing this as a reaction to the oversupply of wineries. And some of the cases I've been involved in, we see that the wineries will have anywhere from 2 to 4 years of excess inventory on hand. And this has been a real drag on the profitability of these wineries. So these changes in the market were already happening. We're already creating headwinds and already creating a very difficult situation for the industry prior to tariffs. And with that background, Andrea, what are we seeing as far as the tariff landscape?
So the tariff landscape has significantly changed over recent years, and specifically this year. What I would say is tariffs and trade and the structure of trade is a basic part of geopolitics and around the way we manage trade across the world. Some of the other things that have impacted trade relations and tariff relations are also things like availability, climate trends, and climate impacts on some of the imports and some of the availability of goods. Also, things like globalization versus deglobalization, regulation versus non-regulation, and are also driving some really different ways of looking at how to navigate the commercial viewpoint on imports and exports. And despite pockets of growth, most wineries are navigating this double blind. So that softer demand and a tariff-heavy sanctions environment. On the tariff front, the a lot of tariffs were covered off by trade organizations or trade policy that has been in place for many, many years. And what's happened is since the changes within the US in recent times here, the US government invoked an emergency powers tariff authority, which essentially said that that tariffs needed to be reviewed outside of the traditional methods and that new tariffs should be applied across industry, sort of all over the board across the world. The impact of that was kind of sort of a breakdown of traditional trade relations across the globe and reciprocal tariffs being brought in. So what it's created is just a bit of an onslaught and discomfort and continuous change in terms of what tariffs apply and when. The other issue is that depending on what part of the value chain you are buying in, you're either buying a raw material, you are manufacturing or putting together raw materials into intermediate products or finished product, or maybe you are in the shipping and logistics of those finished goods. And there are different tariffs along different elements or components of that supply chain cycle. What that has sort of complicated the supply chains is typically people aren't understanding the tariffs or the pricing structure that exists all along that entire value chain. So what that does is it makes it very concerning for people in understanding what the true impact is to the price of the finished good that they are procuring. So to put it very simply, you might, when you're talking about the wine industry, a lot of people think about what the end price of a bottle of wine is, but they are possibly not understanding that there are many elements of tariffs and pricing calculation that goes into understanding what the final finished pricing is. Number one, there is glassware, corks, packaging materials, crates, and the fuel that it costs to ship on ocean freight or other, and then of course the importing and exporting tariffs on those finished goods into or out of whatever country that you're in. The other thing about wine that's very unique is wine isn't about nationalism. Wine is a global community. And one of the things that people really love about wine is the fact that as you go to different parts of the world, the wine might be called the same thing, but the grape from a different part of the world is very different. And so knowing where those costs of these tariffs are coming from, depending on where it's where it's grown, where it's packaged, where it's shipped from, and the logistics challenges on that is a totally different pricing structure. So what is upcoming? There has been a lot of challenge to the White House's emergency tariff ability and the legality around enacting that. What is happening right now is towards the end of the year, the Supreme Court is going to be reviewing if the White House is in fact enabled to utilize that as a mechanism to control tariffs. If that assuming that the White House changes things, or even if it stays the same, there are a number of other different tariff structures. The harmonized tariff schedule that isn't this ad valorem tariff, which has been added as a secondary sort of on top tariff. So understanding where you're buying from and what tariffs are in place, and understanding that even if there is a change to the recent tariffs that have been put in place, there still will be a need for understanding what the tariffs are, and how that'll change. Additionally, another key point is even though you're hearing a lot about what's coming in terms of US-based tariffs, there are all these reciprocal tariffs that also will need to be walked back or entered into new trade agreements that we will need to keep watching. So this is something that I guess the news on it is there isn't an easy way to say it, but the importance is to stay focused and stay diligent on understanding and watching sort of globally what is happening to tariffs and what that's doing to drive different demand in market, because surely you're going to see different products available in market until some of this settles out. And one other thing I would just point out here before we go back to Tim is, as we saw coming out of COVID, the supply chain shock lasted quite a long time. A lot of people would say it's still lasting till today. The same thing will happen in the case of the tariff changes and the structural application of these tariffs and reciprocal tariffs globally. This is going to take a long time to settle out, unwind, and probably just to reevaluate a whole new world once things do sort of get to a less volatile nature.
And Andrew, you mentioned the global community aspect of the wine industry. It's very true. And unfortunately for the US wine industry now, with the tariffs, we're seeing that global community shrink quite a bit. So some of the immediate impacts we've seen from the tariffs are that the Canadian market, which was the largest export market for wineries in the US, has basically evaporated. It was about 60 million gallons of wine in 2024. And as of about mid-September, those exports were down about 97%. Some of this was due to actual, bans in different provinces. Others were just kind of a rally around the Canadian flag sort of effect of, we're going to support local Canadian producers here. But we've seen a huge customer of the US wine market just be cut off. And we've seen similar aspects with our neighbor to the south, Mexico, as well as to the Asian export markets as well. So we had a situation where we already had an oversupply of wine in the US and some difficulties in moving that wine. And now some of the biggest customers outside of the US are no longer accessible. This
Right.
will not only impact the wineries, in all likelihood, but the way the wine industry is set up in most of the US is a three-tier system of the producers or the wineries, the distributors, and the retailers. Where we're seeing the pinch happen is really in both the winery producer side and the distributor side. The retailers are, but they have some more diversification. They're able to push other products. They have a little bit less headwinds, of course, that are not specific just to because they're not just specific to the wine industry. What we may wind up seeing with distributors is seeing the smaller players really get pinched and consolidate. And we may wind up seeing kind of a flattening of the distributor landscape with only some of the larger, better capitalized distributors able to survive. And we could see the same thing with the wineries as well. In addition to the contraction of the market, as you talked about, we're going to see higher costs potentially for the materials that go into the wine. So not just talking, of course, about the grapes. Those are mostly grown domestically, although some wineries do import grapes. But we could see higher cost for the imported glass. Currently, about 30% of glass used for wine bottles in the US is imported. So that if that glass continues to be imported at that rate, we'll see higher costs there. About 50 to 60% of the global supply of corks comes from Portugal. Another significant percentage comes from Spain. There's very little cork production in the US. Barrels coming from France would be impacted. So a lot of those costs that go into producing the wine could increase. And as you mentioned, this could have implications for planning of pricing. And some really complicated decisions about how do you deal with a decreasing market but increasing costs. It's certainly not a position that a lot of industries would want to see themselves in. And these tariffs aren't the only headwinds that the industry has been facing. I mentioned as we kick this off, my experience with evaluating uh, hundreds of different wineries in various instances. Most of those, unfortunately, come from issues with wildfires. And that's something else that continues to put pressure on these wineries and being able to plan to know how much is going to come in terms of the quantity you're able to produce, and then understanding how you're going to be able to price it, how you're going to be able to move it. These are all becoming very complicated. They always were complicated, and they're certainly becoming even more complicated. These tariffs, do potentially create some opportunities. I think, that's always the goal, domestically of having tariffs, is that there is a goal of preserving a domestic industry. And so kind of the obvious potential opportunity is that if imported wine is more expensive, if there's a tariff on those wines, that, while demand has decreased, perhaps it's an opportunity for domestic wine to step in and fill in the gap where perhaps the imported wines were displacing some of that domestic production. But I think it also creates, maybe you call it an opportunity, or maybe it's highlighting the necessity of building a resilient supply chain. So I'm curious, Andrea, like how can the players in the wine industry build this resilient supply chain, not just in the instance of tariffs, but wildfires, anything else that could impact their production?
Well, as a Canadian myself, and then also I now live in Las Vegas. And so your comments earlier about how the Canadian changes, not only on the reciprocal tariffs, but the essentially the removal of American products off of the Canadian shelves is it's quite a big shock to see that. And it speaks to how supply chains can sort of change overnight, and the availability of goods can change overnight. And so I look at building resiliency into the supply chain from it on a number of different groups. So starting off with the wineries or the brand owners, building out and understanding a live tariff matrix. So from that, like understanding what the true landed cost of the goods would be as you're looking to sell them into market, all the way from the ability to grow your grapes, all the way through to the packaging. Some of the key components to look at there are even things in terms of, fertilizers or um, uh, other things that protect the crop for the sustainability practices against wildfires or winds or early frosts or any of the other climate factors that could impact the development of the goods. But understanding all of those tariff inputs on where you're getting all of your upstream supply chain products, what does that look like all the way through to just understanding what those costs are going to be shared with the distributors, and then of course to the end product. Look at engineering, it's called tariff engineering, where you look at reducing the dutiable value downstream in the supply chain. So, for example, lightweight glass or trimming secondary packaging, trying to, when you're packing things, packing it in crates that maybe use a different bottle shape or size, which I know is not going to be widely supported in the wine industry, because we're very comfortable with what things look like, the color of the bottle, the look of the label. However, in terms of keeping price and cost down, that is a potential strategy. Contract agility is very important. The ability to leverage different pricing windows, sharing extraordinary cost charges and clauses, and setting up Incoterms for the distribution of goods are ways to control that. Also, looking now at from the distributors or the importers, posting a tariff surcharge as a separate line item where there are clear triggers. So whether it's a clear upswing or a downswing in some of these prices, having contract mechanisms that help to evaluate that ahead of time, help you do some of that modeling and planning, using customs levers, where you can have drawbacks on re-exports, other things like portfolio tactics. Looking at and seeing what's in your portfolio, encouraging some of the down market buyers to look at substitutes, look at local procured goods, even though it does pull away from, typically what was a 90% European market in the US, for example. There are other pockets of amazing and beautiful wine that could be sourced locally. So looking at that portfolio, looking at the mixture of how as a distributor, you are able to share the costs with your downstream, as well as work with your upstream supply chain to ensure that you're reducing those cost impacts as much as you can ahead of time of it coming into the distributor cycle. From the retailers and on-premise, allowing tariff surcharges or mid-cycle price adjustments, building these contracts that are shorter in term, allowing an assortment of substitutions that maybe you hadn't considered before, and then also changing your promo cadence so that you're continuing to educate your customers on what's possible and what's available. For logistics and compliance partners, validating the HS codes in origin can really help make sure you don't make mistakes in calculating your tariffs, ending up causing you to have larger costs than you were expecting. Automating some restrict party screening and pre-planning some alternate routes. So making sure that you've got multiple contracts in place so that if you do need to ship on alternate routes, you will be able to do that and reduce your cycle time and keeping good control over your costs. In terms of the biggest areas in the supply chain for wine that can be looked at, glass and bottles, corks and stoppers, caps and screws, labels and cartons, all of those are probably the biggest area hit, but that also have the potential opportunity for the most innovation and the ability to do some tariff engineering on a relatively low risk. Wood, cooperage and wood inputs, processing and bottle equipment, metals and components in your packing line, in particular aluminum and steel are key commodities that need to be watched very closely. And then the last thing I'll just dive into a little bit more is on that contract agility. And to me, this is where I think maybe the most bang for the buck could be to protect yourself, or at least to ride out what I hope is short-term volatility. Building in things like tariff cost and trigger clauses. So if tariffs or freight or taxes on a certain SKU change by a certain percentage, you adjust the price by the same percentage on the next shipment. So reducing the haggling each time rates move. Shorter terms and regular reviews, 3 to 6 month contracts as opposed to 1 to 3 year contracts. Those give you the ability to be more flexible, and so that you're never sort of stuck in last year's or even potentially last month's assumptions. Surcharge and credit bands, adding a temporary line item for a tariff and a fuel surcharge that when it's fast to apply and it's fast to remove. Following Incoterms that match your control. If you're managing customs, use DDP or DAP. If the distributor manages, use FOB or CIF. And those things spell out who the importer of record is. Again, so there's no surprises in who pays the duty. Let me see, what else do I have? And then just adding in things like a change of law safety valve. If a new law or sanction makes performance illegal or wildly uneconomic, you meet to fix, cancel with notice. That way you're protecting both sides from these sort of black swan incidents that seem to be happening more frequently than previously before. All of these things are typical strategies in supply chain resilience. I think that the main thing now is just really focusing on the ability to be flexible, whether that be in setting your pricing strategy, your marketing strategy, your access to customers, your product strategy. All of those things probably just need to be a little bit more flexible. And then, of course, really staying on top of what's happening. These things are changing fast. There's tariffs announced, then there's delays to those tariffs. There's adjustments and changes to the trade agreements that are in place. The one example being USMCA with Canada and Mexico, and how they're working with the US on what products are still covered by that trade agreement, and what things have additional tariffs levied against them. And that's just one example. Those trade agreements globally need to be watched continuously to see what's happening. Because the other thing that I just will mention, because of who we are as an organization, arbitration is important. And all of these contract terms, all of these negotiated items that you're talking about, if it comes down to arbitration, the cleaner and clearer you are in your contract terms and in your intention, and in your ability to be flexible with your supply chain upstream and downstream, will help so that you don't get into the case of arbitration. And even if you do, you've got some clear guidelines to protect yourself.
This is really crucial, Andrew. I think everything you said that, especially with things changing so quickly, I think that's been one of the hallmarks of this year is kind of the whiplash, the uncertainty around, what terms are actually in place at a given time. But if you have that built in contractually with all of your suppliers, all of the vendors, your customers, then you still have to keep on top of it, but you've got that protection that's built in. You don't have to go back and try to rewrite the contract, or you got stuck in a contract that you wrote based upon what you knew last month, but now that's completely changed and is out the window. So I think that's really helpful. The wine industry, like we talked about, it is facing difficult times, but it's been around for at least 6,000 years. It's not going anywhere overall. We've seen cycles in the industry before, and it tends to come back. I think that we'll see it come back. If you look at the consumption trends, 20, 30 years ago, we saw similar kinds of booms and busts. Um, However, that doesn't mean that we're not going to see negative impacts from the tariffs. Apologies for the double negative there. And some of those negative impacts could be fatal to the businesses that are not resilient. So I think that what we'll see is that those who have invested in resilient supply chains are going to be better positioned to weather this storm, any other storm that may come down the line, and ultimately be prepared to take advantage of the market when it inevitably does come back around. So while it is difficult, instead of focusing on the difficulties, understanding them and being prepared, and being able to pivot, I think that's what's going to be very crucial. So I hope this has been helpful.
Maybe I'll
And
just add on there. Sorry to interrupt you.
oh no,
You made a really good point that I think is important, in terms of considering supply chain, and considering that it is all relationships, and trade is all about relationships. And in any relationship there's struggles and difficulty, and tariffs and trade are no different, and neither is supply chain. The one thing that I think is really critical and key, to managing the supply chain in wine in particular, is protection of small wineries, protection of small suppliers, and protection of diversity within that. And so having a flexible, resilient supply chain is the way that we do that. So I'm sorry to cut in on you, but I just wanted to make sure we had a little shout out for the small producers as well.
no, that's perfect. Thanks so much, and thank you. Stay tuned and check out other episodes in this series to learn more about how tariffs are impacting different industries.